Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy, Gsluke, here with our DFS and prop preview for tonight's Thursday night football matchup between the Broncos and the Saints. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of your exposure. First off, with the DFS side of things, where we'll go through an injury report, some of the ownership and chalk out there for tonight, as well as a few game scripting notes on how I'm approaching that slate, as well as a little player-by-player breakdown. We'll go through everything you need to know there, as well as on the prop side of things with Underdog and Prize Picks, a few props I've already gotten some exposure to give you an idea of how I'm attacking the prop boards as well. So a lot to go through here. Let's start off with, first off, the Showdown side of things and what I'm doing for the single game slate. Though we're not necessarily waiting on any injury news before lock, a lot has already happened on that front. So if you didn't hear already, Chris Olave is out. You also have Derek Carr out for the Saints, and Rashid Shaheed, who had some surgery this week and is not going to be suiting it up. So that's our top two wide receivers. You're starting quarterback right there. Both teams have injuries out there on the defensive side as well. No bigger than Patrick Surtain, who's going to be out for the Broncos at corner. It's a game where a lot of banged up players are showing up. So it's lasted quite a bit into this year where we've had one of these injury games going on. But as the year goes on, this is just going to become more and more common. So if you don't like a nasty slate like this, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to get used to it, because the NFL turns into a laundry list of injuries by the time we get to the end of the year. So all that's accounted for in these projections. Some of the cheaper wide receivers on the Saints are going to be exceptional values that you can get to. You've got Spencer Rattler playing at quarterback, but he was priced up to account for Derek Carr probably being out. So a lot of cheaper wide receivers that we're going to spend some time on, but up top, it's going to be a whole lot of Alvin Kamara. And I guess before we go player by player, give you an idea of how I'm deploying all these different options, the chalk tonight isn't going to be as clear cut because we've got a close spread. It's only a 3-point spread favoring the Broncos. You've also got two very inefficient offenses going against each other. Saints not so bad with Derek Carr, but they are likely going to be a bit of a dumpster fire tonight with Spencer Rattler at quarterback. So you're going to see people playing lower scoring, maybe more running backs, kickers, and defenses on this type of night. So I don't think it's the kind of slate where everyone's stacking one team versus the other, but more so that everyone's going to be building for a low scoring game script. And it's not like I think this is going to be a shootout, but every time there's a low-scoring game doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have two defenses as optimal. Doesn't mean that you're going to have two kickers in the optimal lineup. Maybe it's one of those four kind of players that you're using in a build, but I think a lot of people are going to build very low projecting lineups tonight. They're going to be playing all these defenses and kickers and think that's the way to get there. And sure, that happens once or twice a year. We get one of those defensive first type of games. What's far more common, though, is a PPR-led game, especially in a low-scoring total like this, where maybe it's the PPR wide receivers that you have to have, quarterbacks with their 150 yards, maybe a touchdown out there, running backs, extremely useful on that kind of slate. So in terms of the chalk, I don't think it's easy to just say like, oh, everyone's playing the Broncos tonight, or oh, everyone's playing the Saints. I think the way to get different is to be underweight on some of those lower scoring kind of plays, whether it's the defenses, the kickers. You can see down here, they're all over 20% ownership. I've got the Broncos at nearly 28%, which is kind of crazy for a defense. Maybe the highest owned total ownership that we've had on a defense this year. I mean, the Saints are over 20% themselves, and that would be as underdogs, and a little bit more expensive at $5,200. It's a real ugly slate down low, and people are going to be playing a lot of these just terrible plays, in my opinion. So I'm focusing more on some of the skill position players, especially with all the injuries on the Saints side of things. But now let's go player by player, give you an idea of how I'm approaching each of these different options. So Alvin Kamara going to be a key fixture in my lineups, and if this is going to stay remotely competitive, it's likely going to be because Kamara is shouldering a majority of the load out there for the Saints. They're already the number one team in the league when it comes to rush rate, but in a game without their starting quarterback, their top two wide receivers, you would probably expect that to be even more so the case. So he is projecting for over 20 fantasy points, by far the best projection on the slate. So even though he is 88% owned, I think you could easily make an argument for locking him in lineups tonight. Not to say that he can't get there, but if you're using projections, you're using Sims, he is almost a for sure shoe-in to go out there and get some usage. Not necessarily at captain all the time. I've got him over 30% in that spot. He's nearly 60% owned at the flex spot as well. So maybe the highest ownership number that we've had on any player this year. But his workload, and I would say his floor tonight, he's probably got like a 13 point floor unless he gets an injury. That is huge. I mean, that's 13 point floor. That's higher projection than Cortland Sutton is for a median projection. It's the same projection as Javonte Williams' median, right? Just a little bit below these quarterbacks when it comes to their projected points, which is just ridiculous stuff, right? So that's why I'm going to be playing so much Alvin Kamara tonight. He is expensive. He's nearly $12,000, but you could argue that that is well worth it with the floor and ceiling that he brings to the table. So captain, flex, I think either spot would make sense, but the more clear landing spot for me is going to be at flex, just because 18 grand or nearly 18 grand at captain is just pretty hard to pull off. Courtland Sutton is way overpriced, but that is keeping his ownership a little bit lower than it should be. If this was a slate where we had Shaheed, we had Olave up top to go out there and choose from, he'd probably be 20% owned. No one would be using him because he's way too expensive, but because it's a weird slate, he's nearly 50% owned. So he's a little bit lower owned than some of the other options up here. Like, you've got Nix and Rattler over 60, even 75% out there for Bo Nix. Javonte Williams, I've got at 55% himself, so, he's at least 10% lower than Javonte, 20, 25% lower owned than some of the other players up here, but he's still higher owned than he probably should be. So unless you're in the large field GPP, you have to get a little bit different with your build. He is not my favorite play for tonight, and I will likely be under the field out there on my exposure. These quarterbacks are okay plays. I'd say the price tag is the main real thing that makes them attractive out there for tonight's contest. Both projecting for solid points per dollar value on par with a player like Alvin Kamara. So if you're going to go with more of a balanced, high-scoring build, I mean, if you took both quarterbacks, you played at least one, maybe two wide receivers from either team, that's going to be a very different kind of lineup. And typically, that's not a different build. Usually, people are building for shootouts, especially when it's two competent teams going against each other. But when it's the Broncos and the dumpster fire of the Saints this week, I don't think you're going to see a lot of double quarterback lineups, and it's tough to do if you're playing an Alvin Kamara. So that's the other aspect of it, is the salary component of taking both these $9,000 quarterbacks. But if you can make it work, I think it's a way to instantly get different in the large field GPPs, as a lot of people aren't going to build that way tonight. Javonte is a really solid option if you want to stack up the Broncos. I do have to say that with all those guys out for the Saints, I think it could be real ugly for them tonight. And if they're going to turn the ball over often, especially in their own territory, Javonte Williams is going to have a lot of touches at running back. Juwan Johnson is the best skill position player other than Alvin Kamara that the Saints still have left over. Unfortunately, though, he is way too expensive at nearly $7,000. So a lot of what I said about Courtland Sutton and just him being way too expensive is a lot of what I have to say about Juwan Johnson. Jaleel McLaughlin, a lot of the same as well, only a 1.1x points per dollar value, which is why I think this slate is so nasty. I mean, you got low ownership numbers on both of these kind of players, but it's just not worth the squeeze unless you're in a large field GPP hoping for a ceiling outcome. If you're in a single entry cash or even a smaller field GPP where you don't need the absolute nuts, there's just no reason to get to these guys that are projecting for like 1 points per dollar. These kickers and defenses, they're okay projections. I think they're going to be a lot more popular than they probably should be, though. You can see they're in that 1.5 to maybe 1.6 range when it comes to their points per dollar value, yet they're going to be higher owned than pretty much everyone else in this range. So I prefer like a Deshaun Vele down here. He's been seeing a lot of targets, especially last week out there for the Broncos. It's these skill position players, and now we've gone down here to these Saints wide receivers, which is really where I think you can win or lose the GPP tonight. A lot of people are going to play Bub Means after his solid performance last week. It was really his first week all year that he's done jack shit for the Saints. And I went to University of Pittsburgh. I watched a lot of Pitt football. Bub Means is a decent wide receiver, but I hate to say this because he's from my alma mater, but he's nothing special. I say that tongue-in-cheek, I feel bad saying it, but he's $4,000 and everyone's treating him like he's Chris Olave Jr. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on this ownership number. I think in like single entries, some of your higher dollar stuff, that Bub Means might be close to 50% owned. And personally, I'd rather take some of the more veterans out there, like Cedric Wilson Jr., for example. He just had his Q tag shed, so he should be healthy for this week. He really knows that offense down there in New Orleans. You've even got backup tight end Foster Moreau that I think makes quite a bit of sense. Mason Tipton, though he hasn't had a lot of production this year, has had a lot of down the field targets. I mean, you saw that in the game against the Falcons a few weeks ago. Wasn't able to haul them in, but had multiple targets of like 30, 40 yards downfield. That is huge out there for Showdown. While I'll have Bub Means, especially if I'm going to play in like GPPs, right, he's going to be a part of my player pool, the best projecting player when it comes to these cheaper Saints wide receivers. I just see a lot of opportunity for guys like a Wilson Jr., especially a Moreau, a Tipton, as I just mentioned, even Lucas, sorry, wrong team down there. I was going to say Lucas Krull, but that's the wrong team. Even Equinemius St. Brown down here at $200 is likely going to be active out there for New Orleans. And I think a lot of those players who I'd rather take in the large field GPPs, even single entries, just because I think Bub Means is going to be that chalky tonight, is the lower ownership numbers. You've got Wilson at only 13%, a Moreau at sub 10% ownership. A Tipton is 20%, so he's getting some attention himself. But if you went down to St. Brown, let's say he is active for tonight, he's 1.3% owned. So I think in large field GPPs, you're going to see a lot of people playing the same kind of lineups. Maybe they're starting with a Kamara, they're mixing in one of these two quarterbacks. I think that'll be a very popular start. I think you're going to see people mix in one of the kickers or defenses into almost every lineup that they're entering. And then what they're going to do down here is they're going to take a Bub Means or a Mason Tipton, right? That's going to be one of their value pieces out there from the Saints. If you're building lineups like that, I think from a pure projection standpoint that would make a lot of sense. That's first off the most popular game script that we're going to see tonight, also just the highest projected plays on the slate. But unfortunately, you're going to be building how everyone else is building out there. The way to just make it slightly different is to say, you know what? Maybe I don't take a defense in this lineup. Maybe I'm not taking a kicker, right? It's a calculated gamble because of how nasty the game is, but it's at least going to give you the leverage and give you some game theory in the large field GPP. So if you're playing in some of the smaller field stuff, maybe you embrace the lowest scoring game script, but I would say if you're in the larger field contest, you need to find some differentiation in a 20,000 plus entry contest, then I would at least push back and tell you to try and get a little uncomfortable. Try and play a game script that you maybe weren't considering heading into the night, just because I think you're going to see so many people building the same way. On the prop side of things, only 2 props we're going to go over this time. And honestly, it's because this game is dog shit. This is probably the most ugly game we've seen for quite some time. I think that if you have a really solid take on what you think is going to happen tonight, that you're honestly full of shit. You've got so many backups in for the Saints, especially, that if you're predicting the outcomes over there, outside of Kamara, who is the only Saints player that I'm taking a prop for tonight, good luck trying to figure out what happens. So these are 2 props I'm taking. These are the only 2 I have on Patreon so far. Probably at least one more slip I'm going to add before lock. So check out the Patreon page for that and that piece of exposure. But it's going to be an over in Alvin Kamara rushing yards, who's at 68.5 on a lot of books. I believe he's at 67.5 on Pinnacle. So that's likely where they're drawing these lines from. And I'm taking an over in his rushing yards just because I think the usage goes ways up. He was already on the most rushing heavy team in the NFL, but without all those skill position players, I could see them running the ball like 55 to 60% of the time, contingent, of course, on this game staying competitive. And the reason why I'll take this prop, especially on Alvin Kamara here, is that, we obviously need that game skip to cooperate, but we need the same thing with the Bo Nix prop too. So there's some correlation between these two. If for some reason the Broncos go out there and kill the Saints tonight, which I honestly do think is a possibility, but I do think it's probably a sub 25% outcome. If it stays competitive though, so let's say it stays within a 1-score game either direction, maybe even the Saints go out there and get a lead over the Broncos. If that happens, that would be really beneficial for this kind of slip. One thing we need to avoid is a Broncos onslaught, because if the Broncos are playing from way ahead, Bo Nix probably isn't passing 31 plus times. On books, by the way, he's at 31.5 on a lot of them. The books that have him at 30.5, he's using that minus 125 to minus 130 range towards the over. So with a little bit of line value on both of these, it's a very slight line value on either one, if anything. But what I more so like is the correlation in that this is likely the game script that we see tonight. I think it's going to be a low-scoring, really ugly sort of affair where no team is going to score enough points to get out of touch with the other one. So if it's going to be like, a big lead for one team or the other, I think it's like at most 2 touchdowns. And even if the Saints are playing from behind on 2 touchdowns, they're still going to commit to the run. I mean, they've got their backup quarterback in there, no wide receivers to speak of. Alvin Kamara, unless they're losing by like 17 plus points, I see him getting all the touches he needs to go over this kind of line, and vice versa with Bo Nix. If they're not up by more than 2 touchdowns, touchdowns, then they're likely still going to have to continue to pass with how inefficient they've been on the ground rushing the ball. So you've got guys like Javonte Williams. He's only at like 11.5 rushing attempts, maybe 12.5 on a few books. Their backups like McLaughlin, he's at like 5.5 rushes and juiced way under. So they don't think that the Broncos are going to run the ball very often tonight. That's what you would glean from that kind of those lines that you have out there on those players. So that's why I like this over on passing attempts. So some correlation between these two. This is the only slip that I've taken so far. Don't force an exposure, guys, right? Like, obviously I like to do stuff for the content out there, do stuff for my Patreon members, but you're never going to see me forcing more exposure than I want to get to. Sometimes on a golf slate, I'll have 30 slips. I'll enter the whole board out there on a golf slate from time to time. And sometimes there's no slips I'm going with. Maybe only one slip I'm going with on the golf side too. Football's the same kind of way. So just obviously only enter stuff that you think you have an edge on. And if you don't see one, then stay away from it. There's no shame in doing so. You don't have to bet every single game, especially if you're trying to be a long-term profitable bettor. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got for the Thursday Night Football preview. Go ahead, smash that like button if you guys haven't already, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content to come. That'll include our main slate preview for this week, Monday Night Football videos, as well as all the content throughout the rest of the season. So make sure you guys subscribe, stay tuned for all of that to come, and best of luck with all of your exposure this evening. Whether it's over there on DFS, go down, take down a GPP for me or two, or over there on the prop side, let's go out there, cash out our prop slip, and go ahead, comment down below who you've got as your top fantasy scorer in tonight's game for a chance to earn a free month on my Patreon page. If you can give me the top scorer in terms of their raw score, so not the captain score that's 1.5 times, if you get that within 2 points and the top scorer, you will win a free month on my Patreon page. So on there, of course, is where you get access to all the spreadsheets that you see, where I have my projections, player pool, stack info over there for DFS, and where I'm posting all my props for Underdog and Prize Picks. So if you want to see any exposure I'm adding before lock, that is the place to be, as well as for an updated look at all my projections and the exposure I plan on getting to as well. So go ahead, comment your top scorer down below, as well as your projection for them out there this evening. But that's all I've got, guys. Best of luck with the giveaway and your exposure tonight, and let's make it a fun one.